I hope you were like me on Wednesday morning and woke up with a deep sense of gratitude for the awesome revival that we had. Amen? We should give God praise for the gift of our revival, but we should particularly thank Kevin and our musicians and Jamel and our choir for blessing us at our revival. Amen? Because they put in a whole lot of work and preparation to make sure that they were ready to lead us in our worship. Make sure you thank those members of the hospitality committee because they made sure that we had food and drinks and an opportunity to really celebrate together as a community. And even though Deacon Lawrence Houston is back at home in New Orleans, we want to make sure that he knows how grateful we are for the word that he brought to us, for the spirit that he brought to our parish community. And hopefully, as we reflect on that theme, that hope does not disappoint, that we'll just kind of hold on to some of those messages that Deacon Houston brought us. The message that it takes just one touch. And the fact that as disciples of Jesus, sometimes we just got to hold on and press on. I think those were all good reminders for us. You know, the whole reason why we have a revival as a parish is because we recognize that sort of in our individual spiritual lives, and then collectively as a congregation, there's moments that we need to have our spirits revived. Moments that we need to be rejuvenated and re-energized for the mission that God is calling us to. We recognize that there are all sorts of challenges in the world around us that weigh us down as we try to fulfill this mission of sharing God's love in our world. And in a real way, the revival sort of serves as a springboard for all the activities that take place in our parish. After kind of the lull of the summer, and even though we're not really a sleepy parish here at St. Moses the Black, things actually do slow down just a little bit during the summer here. But after this weekend, everything picks back up again. And the revival is meant to revive our spirits so that we can embrace what God is calling us to do. That's why I'm excited for the gospel that we heard proclaimed today as we gather for this 22nd week in ordinary time, as we come on this first Sunday after our revival. Because I think that in the parable that Jesus teaches from the Gospel of Luke, there's sort of this simple idea that's presented to us that might not be so obvious. And I think what Jesus was trying to convey, not just to the Pharisees in this moment, but at all sorts of different moments in Jesus' ministry, is that those who want to be followers of Jesus have to practice what they profess. They have to be willing to practice what they actually profess. You see, Jesus gives a parable that's sort of in line with all of the Gospels that we've been hearing over these last weeks. A theme that's been emerging in the Scriptures and the teachings of Jesus. This teaching that the first shall be last. That those who become a servant to all actually become the greatest. Those that are willing to humble themselves will be exalted. This theme that Jesus is trying to engage his disciples with so that they could think differently about how they move and operate and have their being in the world around them. And so Jesus wasn't trying to give some type of tips on party planning. And the parable that Jesus uses today to teach those that he dined with wasn't a discourse on how they should sort of set up the seating arrangement at celebrations. No, Jesus was calling them to pay attention to something much deeper. And that invitation and that challenge, that call that Jesus offered to those that he dined with is the same call and challenge and invitation that's offered to us this day. For me, that first verse is what's grabbed and held my attention all week. That it was on a Sabbath that Jesus went to dine in the house of one of the leading Pharisees, and everybody was carefully observing him. Luke 14, verse 1. A whole lot in that one verse that offers us an opportunity to unpack this morning. That becomes sort of the base for this important principle that we have to practice what we profess. See, I think to really understand what Jesus is talking about in the parable, and what Jesus often talks about when he brings up the Pharisees or the scribes or the Sadducees, is to really understand who the Pharisees were. See, the Pharisees were this religious group of Jewish people. And the thing about the Pharisees is that they were strict in their observance of the law. That's why the Pharisees, oftentimes when we hear about them in the New Testament, are the people who are looked to as the legal scholars. I mean, these are individuals who are learned together about what the law of God speaks about. And the Pharisees were people, religious authorities in the life of the community, who were oftentimes calling others to live according to the law. But there's some other things about the Pharisees that aren't maybe so obvious to us as we read the scriptures. See, the Pharisees were these people who practiced religious piety. It's a fancy way of saying that they expressed what they believed. And they weren't always perfect at it. And oftentimes their expression of their faith, their piety was actually more like self-righteousness in the moment. But the other thing about the Pharisees that was not like all of the other Jews at the time of Jesus was they actually believed in the afterlife. And more than that, they believed in the resurrection. I mean, this was a group of people who believed that when the Messiah came, it would usher in this messianic era that would cultivate this ability to follow him and would ultimately bring about the resurrection of the body. It's sort of interesting to know more about the Pharisees because at least what they profess to believe isn't all that different from what Jesus himself was believing and what Jesus himself was preaching and teaching as he went into synagogues. And that's oftentimes where the tension came between Jesus and the Pharisees. The fact that Jesus was a rabbi, a teacher, someone who could walk into a synagogue and break open the scroll and preach and teach in a compelling way that was definitely in line with the tradition. But oftentimes, Jesus' interpretation disturbed the Pharisees and kind of upset them because what Jesus was saying wasn't exactly in line with their interpretation of the law. And more than that, Jesus did all sorts of stuff that just didn't make it appear that he was living in accordance with the law. See, that's why the context of this parable becomes so important. Jesus is in the home of one of the leading Pharisees to celebrate the Sabbath. You know, the Sabbath is this moment in the life of the Jewish community that is governed by all sorts of law and ritual and tradition. It's a celebration of the Sabbath where people would gather together for some type of theological discourse and interpretation of sacred scripture. And the fact that Jesus is at the home of one of the leading Pharisees, I mean, this means it's a prominent person in the life of the community. And oftentimes, the person that's hosting the Sabbath invites neighbors and strangers to come into their home for the celebration of the Sabbath. That's why everybody was carefully observing how Jesus was going to act in this moment, right? I mean, this is at a moment in Jesus' own ministry and mission where people are starting to question whether or not he really is the teacher that he presents himself to be, whether or not he's really living in accordance with the law like he says that he's living. See, Jesus says in different moments that he's come not to abolish the law, but to fulfill the law. And so Jesus had a clear understanding of what it was that the Pharisees believed in, the faith that they professed. But his critique of them was that they weren't always living in accordance to what they said they believed, to the faith that they said they professed. The Pharisees were carefully observing Jesus because they recognized that he wasn't living according to their own interpretation of the law. I mean, Jesus was critiquing the Pharisees because they were more concerned about the letter of the law than the spirit of the law. When Jesus was asked the question, "Teacher, which is the greatest of the commandments? Which is the greatest of all of the laws?" Jesus responds by saying, "You shall love the Lord your God with all of your heart, all of your strength, all of your mind, and all of your soul. And the second is like it. You shall love your neighbor as yourself." See, what Jesus was saying is that the spirit of the law is love. And Jesus comes not to abolish the law, but to fulfill the law. That Jesus comes into this world, that God sends his only begotten Son into this world so that he might fulfill this promise to bring God's love, the Father's love, into the lives of other people. But the thing is, Jesus didn't live always according to the law. See, on the Sabbath, nobody's supposed to do any type of work. And yet on the Sabbath, Jesus was walking around healing people. Or Jesus was walking with his disciples as they went through that field of wheat and they were plucking the heads of grain off as they walked around. And worse than that, Jesus spent his time with all sorts of unsavory characters. I mean, Jesus was hanging out with prostitutes and tax collectors and politicians and all sorts of other outcasts in the life of the community. And maybe even worse than that, Jesus constantly and continually put himself in a position that others could label him as ritually unclean, as ritually impure. Like when that woman who had been bleeding for 12 years reached out just to touch the hem of Jesus' garment. Or as Jesus encountered the lepers through his ministry. Or as Jesus walked into people's homes that he should have never walked into, at least according to the Pharisees. See, all of these are the moments where the Pharisees and the community are carefully observing what Jesus was doing. It wasn't just about this one dinner on the Sabbath at the leading Pharisee's house. No, it was about everything that Jesus was doing. Jesus was constantly being observed, and people were constantly talking about Jesus' actions and constantly questioning how he could do what he was doing and how he could say who he said that he is. All of that is right there in this one verse. But the thing we should know about the Pharisees, and Dr. Nemo can tell us more about this, is that the Hebrew word for Pharisee, the sort of root of it, means separated ones. That's what Pharisee means. It comes from the Hebrew root that means separated ones. That the Pharisees were the separated ones in the community. That was their self-righteousness. That was them exalting themselves to a position of authority and leadership over everybody else in the life of the community. They thought that they had it right and everybody else was a heathen. They were the church people who were talking about everybody else who didn't look like them and act like them and dress like them and think like them and believe like them and worship like them when they came into the synagogue. So the Pharisees were the separated ones from everybody else. See, that's the contradiction to Jesus' own mission. Because in Jesus' mission, he comes to bring together the lost tribes of Israel. He comes to go to find the lost sheep of the house of Israel. Jesus comes to be a light to the Gentiles. Jesus comes not to separate people from one another, but instead to unite people together, to draw people together, to share this gift of the Father's love that is meant to be universal. A love that is absolutely unconditional. That's why over and over again, Jesus refers to the Pharisees as a bunch of hypocrites because they weren't practicing what they professed. The psalmist said it in Psalm 68 today. The God of Israel, the God that you and I come to worship today, that God is the father of orphans and the defender of widows, and the one who makes a home for the forsaken and brings prisoners to a place of prosperity. That's the God that the Pharisees said that they worshiped, that they served, that they loved, that they were trying to invite others to come to know. And yet their actions over and over and over again said something contrary to what they professed. And so Jesus called them out for their hypocrisy. And Jesus challenged them for their system of beliefs that made a burden on other people as they tried to interpret the law. And so Jesus sits at a table in the home of one of the leading Pharisees and critiques how they gathered on the Sabbath. It's sort of the irony that's here in our gospel today. that all those who were there to dine in this Pharisee's house were carefully observing Jesus, when in actuality, it was Jesus who was carefully observing them. Not just in this moment, but in all of the moments that Jesus was out here in the world, engaging with people, he was carefully observing whether or not people were actually living out the faith that they said they professed. See, I find this word to be challenging for us, particularly in this moment, and particularly for us who live here in the United States. Because we live in a nation that says that it is formed and guided, built upon these Christian values. And we don't have to question it. We could just pull out our cash, any of our money right now, and see, even though we're supposed to be in a nation where there's a separation of church and state, on every piece of currency it says, "In God we trust." We say that we live in this nation under a banner of Christian values, that our culture, our laws, the way that we operate as a nation is meant to be reflective of the Christian values of those founding people of our country. And yet, I think that the practices that we see taking place in the world around us, in our country around us, should cause us to question whether or not this is really true. I think that, like Jesus, who was carefully observing what was happening in the world and the culture around him, we too are supposed to be carefully observing what's happening in the world and the culture around us. I mean, there seems to be a contradiction in our country to say that we are a nation that is built on Christian values, when in the courts right now there's a debate over alligator Alcatraz. A contradiction. That in a nation that says we are built on Christian values like family, that ICE are being dispatched to cities all across the country to detain people and to separate families in this moment. A contradiction that in a country that says we live by our Christian values, that things like racism and discrimination and sexism and homophobia and transphobia might continue to run rampant in our country. A contradiction. To say that we belong to a nation of Christian values when there are cuts coming to SNAP and Medicare that will ensure that the poor get poorer and the sick get sicker. A contradiction to our Christian values in this nation that says that we should send the National Guard into a place like Chicago instead of releasing federal funds that would allow us to build community and provide jobs and open mental health centers and create housing opportunities for people. A contradiction in a country that says that we live by Christian values, but we don't have a respect for life from womb to tomb. A contradiction to our Christian values that elders in our community have to make a choice between food and prescriptions. A contradiction to our Christian values that we are not living as God in fact calls us to live. And what Jesus would say to the Pharisees 2,000 years ago, and what he would say to those who want to co-opt the gospel for their own political or personal gain, is that you are a bunch of hypocrites. And so what's asked of us as followers of Jesus is to carefully observe what's happening in the world around us, and then to be more like Jesus. To have this holy boldness within our spirit that does not allow us to settle for the way that things are. A holy boldness that allows us to call out those elected leaders who want to co-opt the gospel for their own agenda. A holy boldness that brings us to a place of protest and resistance in the face of all sorts of policies that do not reflect the law of love that says we should love our neighbor as ourselves. See, Jesus was calling out the Pharisees for their hypocrisy, for their two-facedness, for their inability to actually practice what they said they professed. And that's our challenge in this moment, is to see a world around us where the gospel is being used for all sorts of other reasons than to gather together the people of God. See, the mission of Jesus was simple and clear. He wanted to establish the beloved community here on earth. Jesus wanted to transform this world to look more like the kingdom of heaven. And every time something got in the way of that, Jesus observed it and called it out. That's what it means for us to be disciples today. To not be people who care about places of prominence and honor, people who don't care about all sorts of titles and accolades. To be people who instead care about serving the least among us. Because as the psalmist declares, the God that we come to worship today is the God of the poor, the God of the oppressed, the God of the voiceless, the God of the disenfranchised, the God of the forgotten. And what God is asking from us is to carefully observe what's happening around us and to call out everything that is contrary to the gospel. Jesus says in the Gospel of John that I have come to give life and to give life more abundantly. Every policy and every practice and every politician that does not seek to give life and to give life in abundance has to be called out. I mean, 20 years ago, Hurricane Katrina devastated the city of New Orleans. And there's all sorts of people who want to ignore the fact that 1,400 people lost their lives in St. Bernard Parish in the lower Ninth Ward, most of whom were African American. Or this past week when 2 children are shot while they are at a school mass in a Catholic parish of Minneapolis. People want to have all sorts of other conversations instead of the one about gun control that we need to have in our country. That's the hypocrisy that Jesus was calling out 2,000 years ago, and that's the hypocrisy that we have to call out this day. That as Jesus walked into that Sabbath celebration, he knew that every eye was on him. Church, that's just as true for us. As a people who come to worship on a Sunday morning and then leave this place, people look at us and carefully observe how we live out the faith that we come here to profess. As I think that's the individual challenge that is offered to each of us. Are we the Pharisees and the hypocrites who keep trying to tell other people what they should believe? Or are we like Jesus, the people who go out into the world and want to spend time with everybody else that's forgotten? That's the choice that we have to make in our own life of discipleship so that we can be a people who truly transform the world around us. So church, the challenge for us this week is simple. Just practice what you profess.